And now, as it often did in the effort to remember who he was, his mind went back to the first few years after the war, to a crumbling block on Bethany Street, in that part of New York where the gentle western edge of the village flakes off into silent waterfront warehouses, where the salt breeze of evening and the deep river horns of night enrich the air with the promise of voyages. In his very early 20s, wearing the proud mantles of veteran and intellectual, as bravely as he wore his carefully aged tweed jacket and washed-out khakis, he had owned one of 3 keys to a one-room apartment on that street. The other 2 keys and rights to the use of the place, every second and third week, had belonged to 2 of his Columbia College classmates, each of whom paid a third of its $27 rent. These other 2, an ex-fighter pilot and an ex-Marine, were older, and more relaxed in their worldliness than Frank. They seemed able to draw on endless reserves of willing girls with whom to use the place. But it wasn't long before Frank, to his own shy amusement, began to catch up with them. That was a time of wondrously rapid catching up in many ways, of dizzily mounting self-confidence. The solitary tracer of railroad maps had never hawked his freight, but it had begun to seem unlikely that any Krebs would ever call him jerk again. The army had taken him at 18, had thrust him into the final spring offensive of the war in Germany, had given him a confused but exhilarated tour of Europe for another year before it set him free. And life since then had carried him from great strength to strength. Loose strands of his character, the very traits that had kept him dreaming and lonely among schoolboys, and later among soldiers, these seemed suddenly to have coalesced into a substantial and attractive whole. For the first time in his life he was admired, and the fact that girls could actually want to go to bed with him was only slightly more remarkable than his other concurrent discovery, that men, and intelligent men at that, could actually want to listen and talk to him. His marks at school were seldom better than average, but there was nothing average about his performance in the Beery. All-night talks that had begun to form around him, talks that would often end in a general murmur of agreement, accompanied by a significant tapping of temples, that told Wheeler really had it. All he would ever need, it was said, was the time and the freedom to find himself. Various ultimate careers were predicted for him, the consensus being that his work would lie somewhere in the humanities, if not precisely in the arts. It would, at any rate, be something that called for a long and steadfast dedication, and that it would involve his early and permanent withdrawal to Europe, which he had often described as the only part of the world worth living in. And Frank himself, walking the streets at daybreak after some of those talks, lying and thinking on Bethany Street on nights when he had used the place, but had no girl to use it with, hardly ever entertained a doubt of his own exceptional merit. Weren't the biographies of all great men filled with the same kind of youthful groping, the same kind of rebellion against their fathers and their fathers' ways? He could even be grateful in a sense that he had no particular area of interest. In avoiding specific goals, he had avoided specific limitations. For the time being, the world, life itself, could be his chosen field. But as college wore on and he began to be haunted by numberless small depressions, and these tended to increase in the weeks after college was over, when the other 2 men had taken to using their keys less and less frequently. He was staying alone in the Bethune Street place, taking odd jobs to buy his food while he thought things out. It nagged him in particular. And none of the girls he'd known so far had given him a sense of unalloyed triumph. One had been very pretty, except for unpardonably thick ankles. One had been intelligent, though possessed of an annoying tendency to mother him. But he had to admit that none had been first-rate. Nor was he ever in doubt of what he meant by a first-rate girl, though he had never yet come close enough to one to touch her. There had been 2 or 3 of them in various high schools he'd attended, disdainfully aware of him in their concern with college boys from out of town. What few he'd seen in the army had most been seen in flickering miniature, strains of dance music through the distant golden windows of an officers' club. Though he'd seen plenty of them since, in New York, they'd always been climbing in or out of taxis, followed by the grimly hovering presences of men who looked as if they'd never been boys at all. Why not let well enough alone? As an intense nicotine-stained Jean-Paul Sartre sort of man, wasn't it simple logic to expect that he'd be limited to intense nicotine-stained Jean-Paul Sartre sorts of women? But this was the counsel of defeat, and one night, bolstered by 4 straight gulps of whiskey at a party in Morningdale Heights, he followed the counsel of victory. "I guess I didn't get your name," he said to the exceptionally first-rate girl, whose shining hair and splendid legs had drawn him halfway across a room full of strangers. "Are you Pamela?" "No," she said. "It's Pamela over there. I'm April. April Johnson." Within 5 minutes he found he could make April Johnson laugh, that he could not only hold the steady attention of her wide gray eyes, but could make their pupils dart up and down and around in little arcs while he talked to her, as if the very shape and texture of his face were matters of absorbing interest. "What do you do?" "I'm a longshoreman." "No, I mean really." "I mean really too." He would have showed her his palms to prove it if he hadn't been afraid she could tell the difference between calluses and blisters. For the past week, under the guidance of a rough-hewn college friend, he'd been self-consciously shaping up on the docks each morning and swaying under the weight of fruit crates. "Starting Monday, though, I've got a better job. Night cashier in a cafeteria." "Well, but I don't mean things like that. I mean, what are you really interested in?" "Honey," and he was still young enough so that the audacity of saying "honey" on such short acquaintance made him blush. "Honey, if I had the answer to that one, I bet I'd bore us both to death in half an hour." 5 minutes later, dancing, found that the small part of April Johnson's back rode as neatly in his hand as if it had been made for that purpose alone. And a week after that, almost to the day, she was laying miraculously nude beside him in that first blue light of day on Bethune Street, drawing her delicate forefinger down his face from bow to chin, whispering, "It's true, Frank. I mean it. You're the most interesting person I've ever met." "'Cause it's just not worth it," he was saying now, allowing the blue-lit needle of the speedometer to tremble up through 60 for the final mile of highway. They were almost home. They would have a few drinks, and maybe she would cry a little. It would do her good. And then they would laugh about it, and shut themselves in the bedroom, and take off their clothes, and in the moonlight her plump little breasts would nod and sway and point at him, and there wasn't any reason why it couldn't be like the old days. I mean, it's bad enough having to live amongst all these damn little suburban types, and I'm including the Campbells in that, let's be honest. It's bad enough having to live among these people without letting ourselves get hurt by every little half-assed "What'd you say?" He glanced briefly away from the road and was startled to see by the light of the dashboard that she was covering her face with both hands. "I said yes. All right, Frank. Will you just stop talking now before you drive me crazy?" He slowed down quickly and brought the car to a sandy halt on the shoulder of the road, cutting the engine and the lights. Then he slid across the seat and tried to take her in her arms. "No, Frank. Don't do it. Just leave me alone, okay? Baby, it's only that I want— Leave me alone. Leave me alone." He drew himself back to the wheel and put the lights on, but his hands refused to undertake the job of starting the car. Instead, he sat there for a minute, listening to the beating of blood in his eardrums. "It strikes me," he said at last, "that there's a considerable amount of bullshit going on here. I mean, you seem to be doing a pretty good imitation of Madame Bovary here. And that's 1 or 2 points I'd like to clear up. Number 1, it's not my fault the play was lousy. Number 2, sure as hell not my fault you didn't turn out to be an actress, and the sooner you get over that little piece of soap opera, the better off we're going to be. Number 3, I didn't happen to fit the rule of dumb, insensitive, and suburban husband. I've been trying to hang that one on me ever since we moved out here, and I'll be damned if I'll wear it. Number 4, she was out of the car, running away in the headlights, quick and graceful, a little too wide in the hips. For a second, as he clambered out and started after her, he thought she meant to kill herself. She was capable of damn near anything at times like this. But she stopped in the dark roadside weeds 30 yards ahead, sat a luminous sign that read "No passing." He came up behind her and stood uncertainly, breathing hard, keeping the distance. She wasn't crying, she was only standing there with her back to him. What the hell? Come back to the car. No, I will in a minute. Just let me stand here a minute, okay? His arms flapped and fell, and as the sound and the lights of an approaching car came up behind them, he put one hand in his pocket and assumed a conversational slouch for the sake of appearances. The car overtook them, lighting up the sign, the tid shape of her back. Then its taillights sped away, and the drone of its tires flattened out to buzzing in the distance, and finally faded to silence. On the right, in a black marsh, the spring peepers were in full and desperate song. Straight away, 200 or 300 yards away, the earth rose high above the moon, the telegraph wires to form the mound of Revolutionary Hill, along whose summit winked the friendly picture windows of Revolutionary Hill Estates. The Campbells lived in one of those houses. The Campbells might well be in one of those cars whose lights are coming up behind them right now.